Okay, good morning, Chevra. B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to start today Masechet Megillah. I always like, before Purim, to try to learn this Masechet because obviously this is the halachot and the theme of the day. So we have about 2 months now till Purim, which means we'll try to do, there's about 30 dapim, so we'll try to do about an amud yomi, an amud a day. It's a little bit quick, but B'ezrat Hashem, we'll try to go clearly and make sure we get the main points here. Now, just as an introduction to the Masechta, as we begin today, Baruch Hashem, really it's unbelievable. Purim is less than 2 months away. It's almost unbelievable. But anyways, just as a simple introduction, we know that maybe the most important mitzvah of Purim is, like we always think about at least, in terms of Purim, is reading the Megillah. We always think about that mitzvah as being the focal point of Purim. It's where we remember the storyline and the nisim and the miracles. Now, what day are we supposed to read the Megillah? So we read it on Purim. Well, what day is Purim? So if you look in Megillat Esther, there's 2 days that are mentioned. If it's hot, you could turn on the air if anybody needs. There's 2 days that are mentioned in Megillat Esther. We have in Adar, the 14th of Adar, and the 15th of Adar. Those are the 2 dates that are mentioned in terms of the days that are kept as Purim. Why are there 2 different days? So this brings us to the Mishnah we're going to start with today. And what is that? There's 3 types of cities, essentially, and each of these cities has different laws in terms of reading the Megillah. Now the standard, which we keep in Miami, and the normal thing, is Purim is on the 14th of Adar. That's the standard. That's the regular thing. Why is that? Let me just speak this out. Because when they fought in the general world to prevent the Goyim from destroying them, when the Jews fought to protect themselves, it was on the 13th of Adar, and then they rested on the 14th. So we created the 14th as the day of Purim for future generations as well. However, there was a city called Shushan, which was a walled city, meaning it was mukafot choma. We'll get into the terminology momentarily. There was a wall around it, and based on that, and they fought an extra day. They fought the 13th and the 14th, and they only rested on the 15th of Adar. So the 15th of Adar became their Purim, and that's when they're going to read Megillah. So far what we have is unwalled cities. Regular unwalled cities are going to read the Megillah on the 14th. Walled cities read Megillah on the 15th. Now there's another type of city which is really be'etzem considered an unwalled city. But they have a unique halacha because they have a unique circumstance. What is this called? Kfarim. Kfarim is a village. Kfarim. Now these Kfarim, they used to live on the outskirts of the big cities. They were like the farmers. Simpler people. They did not have people in their cities who knew how to read the Megillah. So they had to go into the large cities and hear the Megillah from them. In addition to that, since they were the farmers, they used to bring food and drink and sell it, like in the shuk. They used to bring from their outskirts, the surrounding villages, to the main city and sell their wares there. Now they have a unique halacha. The etzem they should read on the 14th because it's an unwalled city, like regular unwalled cities. But Chachamim were lenient with them, and we'll learn more about that in the Gemara, because they provided help. Right? They bought the pizza, so therefore, since they provided help, Chazal gave them a kula, leniency.
Did they charge?
I don't know, they charged. I guess they did, it's true. You don't charge, that's true. Chazal gave them a leniency, which was as follows. They used to come in every Monday and Thursday. We'll see, there's 2 reasons why we'll speak that out. So Chazal said, when you come in on Monday and Thursday, you could read Megillah that day that you come in. Now, it might not be the 14th and it might not be the 15th, but they had 3 days before, which if that's a Monday and Thursday they were coming in anyways, they could read the Megillah to be yotzei their mitzvah. Now what we're going to do and go through this Mishnah is basically a numbers game. We're going to go through if the 14th falls out on every day of the week and figure out when do the villagers read Megillah, when do the unwalled cities read Megillah, and when do the walled cities read Megillah. It's really just a simple numbers game, and we'll discuss these cases B'ezrat Hashem in the Gemara. So let's see. Let's start the Mishnah now, top of the page. B'ezrat Hashem will be successful from beginning to end. So let's see, Megillah. Says Masechet Megillah. Megillah nekreit b'yod aleph, b'yod bet, b'yod gimel, b'yod dal, b'tetvav. The Megillah is able to be read on the 11th of Adar, the 12th of Adar, 13th, 14th, and 15th of Adar. Any of these 5 dates, the Mishnah says, Megillah is allowed to be read. Lo pachot velo yoter, not earlier and not later. So you can't read the Megillah before the 11th or after the 15th. Now, based on the Mishnah continues, like the distinction of the cities that I just said, the walled cities from the days of Yehoshua bin Nun. We know Yehoshua bin Nun conquered the land of Israel, and we'll see that's an important point we'll get to later. But the walled cities from his days, Korin b'Tetvav, they read Megillah on the 15th of Adar. However, Kfarim v'Ayarot Gdolot, the villages and the unwalled cities, Korin b'Yadalid, they read the Megillah on the 14th of Adar. So based on that introduction, well, when would you read Megillah on the 11th, 12th, or 13th? So the Mishnah tells us those days are unique leniencies for the villagers. Let's explain now how that would play out. The villagers were allowed to read earlier on Yom HaKnisa. Knisa literally means to gather. When they would gather in the big cities, which was on Monday and Thursday, Chachamim said they could read Megillah as well. Rashi explains the reason they came in on Monday and Thursday was because that's when the judges would sit in court. So if anybody had any claims or issues, that's when they would go in. Other Rishonim explain here, Monday and Thursday is what? Kriyat Torah. So they would come in to hear Kriyat Torah, they would also be allowed to read Megillah then. Other different ways of explaining. Fine. Ketzad. So let's illustrate now with examples practically how they would read Megillah earlier. So the Mishnah tells us, now just keep the calculation. It's really simple numbers. Let's try to go simple here. If the 14th of Adar falls out on Monday. So now, Kfarim v'ayarot gedolot korim bo bayom. The villagers and the unwalled cities read on the Monday, on the 14th, because that's the real day they're supposed to read. Umukafot choma lemachar, and the walled cities will read on Tuesday, which is the 15th. Beautiful, easy. Chalihiyot bashlishi. If the 14th falls out on Tuesday, o baravi'i, or on Wednesday, kfarim aktimin liyom haknisa. So the villagers will be allowed to read on Monday that they're coming in before, which is going to be either the 12th or the 13th, if it was Tuesday or if it was Wednesday. Va'ayarot gdolot kfarim aktimin liyom haknisa. Va'ayarot gdolot korim bo bayom. And the unwalled cities read on that Tuesday or Wednesday, which is the 14th. Umukafot choma lemachar, and the walled cities will read the next day, which is going to be the Wednesday or the Thursday, which is the 15th. Okay, let's continue. If the 14th falls out on Thursday, so the same as Monday now. The villagers and the unwalled cities read on that day, the 14th, which is Thursday. And the walled cities read the next day, the 15th, which is Friday. Now, if the 14th falls out on Friday, so now you have a unique situation, like this. So logically, the villagers will read on Thursday, because that's the day they come in, which is going to be the 13th. Now, the unwalled and the walled will read on Friday. Why will the walled read on Friday if it's the 14th? Because the 15th is Shabbat, and you can't read Megillah on Shabbat. We'll see in the Gemara why that is. Two reasons the Gemara will give. Some famous reason and less famous reason. But either way, you can't read on Shabbat, so the walled cities will then read on Friday. Now, why can't they read on Sunday?
It's over.
Because the 16th is not an option. Beautiful. If the 14th falls out on Shabbat, so now, if it falls out on Shabbat, you can't read Megillah on Shabbat. So, Kfarim va'ayarot gedolot makdimin v'korin leyom haknisa. The villagers and the unwalled cities go back to Thursday. Now, you could have argued and said, why don't the unwalled cities read on Friday? Or Sunday for that matter. But the Mishnah tells us no. The villagers and the unwalled cities both go back to Thursday. We'll explain in the Gemara. Umukafot choma lemachar. Now the walled cities read the next day, Sunday, which is the 15th. That's perfectly fine. Now, if the 14th falls out on Sunday, kfarim akdimin liyom haknisa, so the villagers go back to Thursday. This is the example when you read on the 11th, because from Sunday back to Thursday is back to the 11th. So the villagers will then read on the 11th. Va'ayarot gdolot korim bo bayom. The unwalled cities read on Sunday, the 14th. Umukafot choma lemachar, and the walled cities read on the 15th, which is going to be Monday. Beautiful. Now, I'm going to read this like Rashi explains. Rashi explains the question as follows. Says the Gemara. The Gemara wonders, let me just speak it out and then we'll see it inside. The Gemara wonders, why is it that the Mishnah says you can read Megillah 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15? The Gemara assumes that it means you're obligated to read on those days. So the Gemara's question then is, why would you be obligated? Where would be the pasuk that would imply you're obligated? The Gemara is going to refute that question and say, you're not obligated, it's a leniency, it's a kula given by the Chachamim to make it easier for the villagers. So the question doesn't start and we'll have to re-explain the question. So the Gemara says like this, Megillah nekret b'yud aleph. The Mishnah had said the Megillah could be read on the 11th. Minalan. Well, what's the source that would say you are obligated, you're chayav to read on the 11th? So the Gemara says, Minalan, what do you mean, what's the source in the pasuk that you're chayav? It's not a chiyuv, it's not an obligation, but rather, later we're going to explain, that the Chachamim allowed these villagers, they were lenient with the villagers, when they kill with them, they allowed them to read earlier, in order that they could provide water and food to their brothers in the large cities, because that's what they did. So this isn't a chiyuv, it's a leniency given to them. So the Gemara says, no, that wasn't our question. You have to understand, like this. This is the question. Michti, let's analyze for a second. Kulu Anshe Knesset Hagdola Takninu. Very important to note here. Who are the Anshe Knesset Hagdola? It literally means the men of the great assembly. Who are these people? So these are, it's not one group of rabbis, really. Really, Anshe Knesset Hagdola was the rabbis that existed from the end of Bayit Rishon into Galut Bavel, and then the story of Purim in Paras Madai, and then also existed into Bayit Sheni after rebuilding the second temple. This was a group of rabbis who created many of the takanot and halachot that we keep till today, including, for example, the brachot and the tefillah, Shmona Esrei. A lot of things that we do practically every single day was established by this extended generations of rabbis. They also established Purim, because Mordechai was part of Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, for example. So the Gemara says, like, this is what our question is. They established reading the Megillah, and they established the leniency of those days. If they established it, and they also wrote the Megillah, they obviously would have referenced it in the Megillah that there is such a leniency. You could read 11, 12, and 13 also. Where in the Megillah did they reference this idea that you could read on those earlier 3 days? That's the question. Because the only thing we know meforash is 14 and 15. So where is the pasuk that references this in the Megillah? That's the question. Let's see. We know that all of these days were established by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. How do we know that? Because if you think they only established the 14th and 15th, could any group of rabbis later come and uproot the takana of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? That would be impossible. They couldn't add days. Why? Because there's a Mishnah Moed Katan that teaches, a later court is not allowed to override an earlier court, unless they're greater in wisdom and number. So it would not be possible that a later court, because there's no later court that's greater than them, that's the assumption. So therefore no one later could establish these days. It's obvious. All of these days were established by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So hey Charamiza, this is the question. Where did they reference it? Where did they allude to it in the words of the Megillah? That's the question. So we're going to have two answers for this, which are really drashot in the Megillah. It's a fascinating thing, by the way, because Megillah, Purim is D'Rabbanan. So it's drashot. You understand? It's drashot in the Megillah. Let's see. Amar Rav Shimon bar Abba, Amar Rav Yochanan, Amar Kros. The first answer is the pasuk tells us Megillat Esther, lekayem et yemei Purim ha'ele bizmanehem, to fulfill these days of Purim bizmanehem. This is the key word, in their times. So the Zmanehem has an extra letters, we'll see in a moment. And by saying it, Zmanehem, in a plural language, it implies that there's more days than whatever is referenced clearly in the Psukim. Zmanim arbe tiknu lahem. They established more days than are directly referenced, more than the 14th and 15th. So Gemara says, but we need the pasuk for itself, because 14th and 15th is plural. That's already 2 days. So maybe Zmanehem only refers to 14 and 15. That's why it's plural. That's why it's Rabim. So Gemara says, Imkein lemakra Zman. It could have just said Zman. If you write 14th and 15th, and then you write Zman, so you know that there's 2 days, because it's already directly referenced. You don't have to reference it again in a plural language. By saying it in Zmanehem, it means there's additional days as well. My Zmanehem, Zmanim Tuva, means additional days. Asks the Gemara, but we still need that pasuk for something else. We'll see this drasha later on Daled Amud Bet. It says, Zmano shel zeh lo kizmano shel zeh. We're going to learn from this pasuk, Zmanehem, that these days are mutually exclusive. What does it mean? Is that someone in a walled city cannot read the Megillah on the 14th, and somebody in an unwalled city cannot read the Megillah on the 15th. Meaning, Zmanehem teaches us the days are unique and you can't exchange. So that's what you need the drasha for. So the Gemara answers, Imkein lemakra zmanam. It could have then just said plural zmanam, but there's a yud that's extra. Ma zmanehem shmat minakulu. So the fact that there's an extra yud teaches us an additional drasha, which is to teach us also this idea that there's extra days. So Gemara says, but wait a second. But once you know that there's additional days, what's to say there's only 3 additional days, 11, 12, and 13? Maybe you could read it all of Adar. Who knows? So Gemara asks, Ema Zmanim Tuva, maybe there's more days than that. Maybe there's 10 extra days. How do you know there's only 3? So the Gemara answers, Zmanehem dumya dizmanam. Because the pasuk of Zmanehem is to be understood as it could have written it Zmanam. Just as Zmanam, the way we're understanding it is, there's a 14th and 15th which are clear in the psukim, so the additional extra drashot should add also another 2. So what's the problem, obviously? We need to add another 3. So the Gemara says, wait a second, Ma Zmanam Trey, Av Zmanehem Trey. So you add another 2. The Ema Trey Sarvit Leisar. Maybe it's only the 12th and 13th. How do you know to add the 11th then? So Gemara answers, one of these 3 days, you don't need a drasha to tell me that you could read on that day, and that is the 12th. The 13th, excuse me. Why the 13th? Because as Rashi explains here, the 13th of Adar was the day that everybody fought across the board. Both the Jews in Shushan and the Jews outside of Shushan. That was the day that they all fought to protect themselves. In Shushan, they fought an additional day. But the ness of the 13th was so obvious, was so great and miraculous, you don't need a drasha for that. That's obvious. So the Gemara says, Kedamar of Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Ve'ema Tracer Blazer Kedaz. Gemara answers, Kedamar of Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Yud Gimel Zman Kihilal Hakol Hi Velot Tzarich Lerbuye. You don't need a drasha to include the 13th because that's Zman Kihilal Hakol. That's when everyone gathered together to fight. There's no necessity to include that, as that's obvious. Hachanami Yud Gimel Zman Kihilal Hakol Hi Velot Tzarich Lerbuye. You don't have to add it. So the Gemara says, therefore the drasha of 2 is for the 11th and 12th because the 13th is obvious. So Gemara says, okay, but how do you know that it's 11th and 12th? Ve'ema shitza v'shivsar. Maybe it's the 16th and 17th. Maybe you could read after the 15th. So Gemara answers, V'lo ya'avor k'tiv. We'll see this drasha later also. V'lo ya'avor, it's a little bit taken out of context, but the way we're expounding it is, lo ya'avor, you can't go, like, la'avor is to pass. You can't go beyond whatever is written mifurash in the pasuk, which is the 15th, and therefore we know it's not beyond the 15th. It's not beyond the 15th, and it's not the 13th, obviously it's 11th and 12th. So therefore this first drasha Zmanehem, which is the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that's the way we know these additional 3 days. Now, for Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar, Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani says another source. Amar Kra, the pasuk tells us, Kayamim asher nachu bahem haYehudim. The pasuk says, like those days that the Jews rested. And the key word is like. So the word like those days, what is it telling us? Yamim kayamim. It means there's additional days like the days the Jews rested, like those days that are said clearly in the Megillah. There's additional days that also you could read the Megillah. The Rabbot Yud Aleph Yud Bet, including the 11th and 12th. Again, Ve'ema Trei Sarat Leisar, the same Shakla V'Tarya. Maybe it's the 12th and 13th. Reb Shmuel bar Yitzchak Yud Gimel. So you don't need to include the 13th because that's the obvious included day, as everyone fought on that day and it was a certain miracle. Maybe it's 16 and 17. But lo ya'avor k'tiv, the pasuk says lo ya'avor, it can't be beyond the 15th, so that's not a question. Now, we have 2 different ways of expounding from the verse in Megillah. So why do we need both drashot? So each of the Amoraim don't agree with their counterpart, and the Gemara explains. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, my time lo amar mizmanehem. Why does Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani agree from Zmanehem? Why doesn't he say you could learn from Zmanehem, which was the original drasha of Rabbi Yochanan? So he says, because he says the extra yud you're expounding for a drasha, I don't really see that in Zmanehem, and therefore I don't want to go with that drasha. Rav Shem bar Abba, why does Rav Shem bar Abba, who is quoting Rabbi Yochanan, my time lo Amar mi Kayamim, why didn't you say from Kayamim, like Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani? So Amar Lecha, Rav Shem bar Abba says, the reason I don't agree with that drasha is Ahula Dorotu Dichtiv, because actually the pasuk of Kayamim is a simple drasha to say, just like in those days they kept Purim and read Megilla, etc., also in our days we do that. But there's no additional drasha there, it's just telling us we should continue to keep it like in those days. Okay, let's move on now. This is really the second section of the day. So now the Gemara tells us is this idea that we've just concluded, that there's this leniency for the Kfarim, for the villagers to read earlier. It's 8:07. To read earlier, will be done in 4 minutes, hopefully. To read earlier, this idea is really only one Tana's opinion. But we're going to see, according to this first version at least, the Chachamim disagree entirely with this theme. So let's see. Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Zu div Rabbi Akiva stimta. If you have to go, you can go there. No pressure. So Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, these are the words of Rabbi Akiva stimta. Rashi learns stimta means this Mishnah is a stam Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva, and he is the author who says the villagers were given this leniency to read earlier on these earlier days. Did Darish Zman Zmanam Zmanehem, because he had this drasha of Zmanehem. But the Chachamim say, Ein korinota ela bizmana, that you can only read it on the 14th and 15th. You could never, not earlier, not later, you could never read earlier or later, not in those days and not in these days. The Gemara says, the problem is we have a Braita that contradicts that, because Amar Rabbi Yehuda says in the Braita, Hey Matai, when are you allowed to read earlier? Bisman shashanim kitikanan is when the years were done properly. Al pi Beit Din, that Beit Din controlled the calendar and told the Jewish people about when there's a leap year, a leap month, etc. The Yisrael Shruyin al Matan, and the Jews lived in their land, which means they could hear the news from the courts when it's going to be a leap year, etc. Aval bisman hazeh, but today hoil mistaklin ba, since they're going to gaze at it, Rashi explains that means that if you would keep Purim before the 14th. Problem is, they would make a calculation, 30 days later is going to be Pesach. The problem with that is, they're going to end up keeping Pesach on the 13th of Nisan, and the last days of Pesach are going to actually not be kept properly. They'll be eating chametz on the days that are really Pesach. So in order to avoid that issue where you don't have a court that controls the calendar and tells people what to do, Oilu mistaklin ba ein korinota ela bizmana. So Rabbi Yehuda in the Braita says, then back in the day when the courts were in control and told people what to do, so you can read it on these earlier days. But today, only on the 14th. So the Gemara says, but according to what you're saying, Rabbi Yehuda aliba deman, which Tana is Rabbi Yehuda following? Ilem aliba Rabbi Akiva. If it's like Rabbi Akiva, filo bizmana zeita la takanta. Rabbi Akiva holds today that takana exists as well, so it can't be like Rabbi Akiva. Elalav aliba Rabbanan, it must be like the Rabbanan. When the court controls the calendar, the Jews lived in their land. Mia karinan, they could read it then back in the day, in the earlier days. So once upon a time, such a takana existed. Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. This is a refutation to Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, Ika de Amri. There's actually another version of this Memra which fits like the Braita. Amar Rabba bar Bachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Zu div Rabbi Akiva stimtoy. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva, the Stam author of our Mishnah. Havel Chachamim Amru Bizmana Zeo Ilim Staklim Ba in Korinota Ela Bizmana. The Chachamim said we agree that there was originally a takana, but since it's going to create an issue today with Pesach being misconstrued, therefore today you can't read it only on the 14th. Tani Nami Hachi, and to this Memra, this version, there is a Braita that supports. Amar Rav Yehuda Matai, when are you allowed to read earlier? Bizman shashanim kitikanan b'Yisrael shrin al matan, when the calendar was done, al pi the courts. But today, the Chachamim say you have to read it on the 14th. Now, Rav Ashi Kashali Rav Yehuda. Rav Ashi brought a contradiction between Rav Yehuda and Rav Yehuda. Umokim la Braita, turning to Bet Mud Bet, and he established the Braita before Kerav Yosi bar Yehuda. Now, what we're about to see is Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah that's coming up. He's going to say that actually even today the takana exists. But in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda said today we don't have this takana because it's going to create an issue with Pesach. So he says as follows: Umi amar Rabbi Yehuda bizmana zeh elu mistaklim ba ein korinota ela bizmana. Did Rabbi Yehuda say, as we just saw in the Braita, that today it's only on the 14th not to make an issue with Pesach? Viramini. The problem is the Mishnah later says amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, A'imatai, when are you allowed to read earlier? Makom shenichnasim b'sheni v'chamishi. If it's villagers who go into the large cities on Monday and Thursday. Aval makom she'enichnasim b'sheni v'chamishi. But if they don't go in on Monday and Thursday, ein korinota ela bizmana. So then you can only read it on the 14th. But what do you see from this Mishnah? Makom shenichnasim b'sheni v'chamishi yeh karinan. That when they do go in on Monday and Thursday, you could read it earlier. Va'afilu bizman hazeh. And Rabbi Yehuda there seems to say, even today this takana exists. So in order to answer this, Rav Ashi said, Umokim la lebraita Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. He said, the Braita before that said the takana doesn't exist today is not the position of Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. And the Mishnah later that says today the takana still exists is like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. We're so makbet on tradition, and you want to just change the name of a Tana just like that? So the Gemara says, Umishum de kashile Drabyuda, because you had a contradiction in Shita. Mokima la Braita Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. You changed the Tana of the Braita, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. So Gemara answers, no. You have to understand. Rav Ashi Shmiya lei Ika de Tani lak Rabbi Yehuda, that there were some versions of that Braita who said it's Rabbi Yehuda. The Ika de Tani lak Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, and there were other versions of that same Braita who said it wasn't Rabbi Yehuda, it was Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. And since he had a contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, Amar, he said, Man de Tani lak Rabbi Yehuda, must be the one who taught that Braita is the author is Rabbi Yehuda, lav dafka. It must be that was not necessarily accurate. And Man de Tani lak Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda dafka. And the one who said that the version of that Braita is Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, that was actually accurate, and that's how it meant to be. Okay, we're going to stop here. Zat Hashem will pick up about 10 lines down, Bet tomorrow. Everyone have a wonderful day.